get started in just a moment. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kat Romano, and I'm the Programming and Human Rights Coordinator at the Montreal Holocaust Museum. I want to welcome everyone to our virtual book talk, Exist Otherwise, The Life and Works of Claude Cahun by Jennifer L. Shaw. Jennifer will be in conversation with Dina Goldstein today. It's very meaningful for us to be coming together for this event as part of Pride Month to give voice to the lesser known stories of members of the LGBTQIA plus community during the Holocaust. We're so grateful for our partners on this event, Temple Emmanuel Beth Shalom, Gava, Jewish Women's Archive, and the Museum of Jewish Montreal. At the Montreal Holocaust Museum, we aim to educate people of all ages and backgrounds about the Holocaust, while sensitizing the public to the universal perils of anti-Semitism, racism, hate, and indifference. Through our commemorative programs and educational initiatives, the museum promotes respect for diversity and the sanctity of human life. Before we begin, I want to go over a bit of housekeeping. Everyone will be kept on mute during the event. And the conversation between Jennifer and Dina will be followed by a Q&A, during which you can ask questions in the chat. If you think of questions during the discussion, you can write them into the chat and we'll monitor them throughout. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can e-message me directly, and I'll try to help you out as best as I can. So now I want to introduce our speakers. So Jennifer L. Shaw is Professor of Art History Emerita at Sonoma State University. She received an MA from the Courtauld Institute of Art, London, a PhD in Art History from the University of California, Berkeley, a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship in humanities at Stanford University, and recently an MFA in fiction from the Bennington Writing Seminars. Jennifer is author of many academic articles and 3 books: Dream States, Puvis de Chavannes, Modernism and the Fantasy of France, Reading Claude Cahun's Disavowal, and Exist Otherwise, The Life and Works of Claude Cahun, which we'll be discussing today. And this last book received praise in Choice Women's Review of Books, Brooklyn Rail, The Cut, and the Gay and Lesbian Review. Jennifer's work on Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore have been featured in the podcast History is Gay and BBC Radio 4's recently released History's Secret Heroes. She is currently finishing her second novel, The Butterfly Artist, based on the life of the 17th century artist and entomologist Maria Sibylla Merian. Dina Goldstein began her career over 30 years ago as a photojournalist, evolving from a documentary and editorial photographer into an independent artist focusing on large-scale productions of nuanced narrative photography tableaus. Her work is highly conceptual and complex social commentary, incorporating cultural archetypes and iconography from the collective common imagination with narratives inspired by the human condition. Sorry for stumbling there. Leaning into the visual language of surrealism, she stages compositions that expose the underbelly of modern life, challenging the notions of cultural influence and inherent belief systems. The vivid and provocative still imagery emerges through an entirely cinematic technique, with Dina's established methodology following a precise pre to post-production process. Goldstein's work has been the subject of academic essays and dissertations, and has been covered extensively in the media around the globe. The projects are studied and taught in art schools, photography programs, and gender studies. The Fallen Princesses are included in elementary school textbooks as teaching tools and subjects of discourse within the classroom. Dina is represented internationally and consistently exhibits at festivals, biennales, commercial galleries, art centers, and museums. And with that, I'll pass it over to our speakers.
Thank you, Kat.
So hello, everybody, and I am very thrilled to be here with you all today, and also thrilled to have discovered and read through Jennifer's book. which was super fascinating. And I have not been able to stop thinking about these two women since I read the book. Jennifer is going to start by reading a passage for us.
Okay, so just to introduce Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, in case somebody isn't familiar with them, they were a lesbian couple who lived and worked in Paris in the 20s and 30s, and then in 1937 went to the Isle of Jersey because they were worried about rising anti-Semitism and fascism in Europe. And then in 1940, of course, the Nazis invaded the island. And when the island was evacuated, they could have left and gone to England or somewhere else, but they chose instead to stay. And they were some of the only non-Jersey natives who actually stayed on the island. And while they were there, they undertook resistance activities that went undiscovered for quite some time, because nobody suspected that these two women who were sort of middle-aged would be doing this kind of thing. So I'm going to read from a section of the book towards the end where I'm talking and they are talking in their own words about their resistance activities. So I'm starting with Marcel Moore's description of this moment in time just after the occupation began. It all started in 1940 and grew as time went on. These are Moore's words. We always listened to the BBC and any other news we could get, which was not painted by Bush propaganda. And it made us perfectly sick to hear news put out by Radio Paris. So we decided to run a news service of our own for the benefit of the German troops. We were inspired by the broadcasts of Colonel Britton on the European service of the BBC. That's the end of her quote. From the first time she ventured out of the house, Cahun watched German troops and noticed some who seemed less than enthusiastic about their work. Surely not all of these soldiers could be Nazis, she thought. Some of them must realize that what they were doing was wrong. This gave her the idea that she might be able to somehow spur the soldiers to question their orders and revolt. She needed to find a way to do this without jeopardizing hers and Moore's lives. One night, Cahun came up with an idea for her first act of intervention. Reading a copy of the satirical magazine Le Crapillot, a special issue dedicated to Germany, she was struck by a phrase that inspired her to a campaign of resistance. Cahun had always used language to challenge the status quo, and as we have seen, her strategy was to undermine the straightforward, potentially repressive or propagandistic use of language. Until now, this political approach to language had taken place only in a theoretical realm. The occupation in France and Jersey offered the opportunity to use the play with words as a concrete tool against the Nazi forces. In the magazine, she read the phrase, and forgive me because I don't speak German, Schrecken ohne Ende oder Ende mit Schrecken, terror without end or end with terror. And she wrote, quote, "These words fascinated me. They were presented in this paper as the Nazi slogan before the power grab. The topicality of this dilemma, corresponding to my point of view on the subject of daily occurrences, I mean to say, corresponding to the information on the radio, was obvious. This was not at all a slogan, but a truth, a tragic observation. How to get the Germans to see this truth? I took a paper and pencil. I wrote Sieg, nein, Krieg ohne Ende, victory, no, war without end. Cahun explains that by morning, she had settled on using only the words without end, because this phrase was less propagandistic than victory, no, war without end, and less easily traceable to a single source. The next day, Cahun went for a walk with Moore along the road near La Roquaise. that's their house, Cahun collected empty cigarette packets that were lying along the road. She brought them home and wrote Ona Enda in pencil or red crayon or pen. She used different writing styles, some capitalization, some title cases, and some quick scribbles. Then Cahun and Moore went for a second walk and discreetly returned the packages to the place where they were found. The women made sure that the writing was facing up so that it could be seen. They also wrote Ona Enda in Gothic letters on any smooth surface they could find that would register the ink of their pens. Their property was in the military zone near the airport and other public buildings that were currently occupied. It was thus perfectly situated for their actions to be seen by the German troops. This was the beginning of their campaign of resistance because they could walk in the area without suspicion. As they began their campaign, the two women did their best to fit in and appear unremarkable. Cahun explains, "We could not have been less remarkable. No hats, old beige walking shorts called jodhpurs, on the feet rubber boots called Wellingtons, a blouse of cotton or wool shirt depending on the temperature, a semi-masculine jacket. When out walking in town, a raincoat on top, a Burberry that's a large number of pockets for our tracts, a scarf wrapped around the head, wool gloves in winter, and the shopping bag as an alibi. We were peasants and also daughters and wives of the bourgeoisie of the gentleman farmer type. My appearance and Suzanne's differed little from the look of the majority of inhabitants on the island." Cahun and Moore began a psychological action of counter-propaganda, at once secret and demystifying, that they hoped would operate by spreading through the ranks of the invader. Their method was détournement, by hyperbole, antiphrase, irony. Thus, after the first intervention on the cigarette packs, the two were able to devise more complex strategies. They created modified newspapers, advertisements and proclamations in German, thanks to Moore's fluency in the language. The local newspaper was now producing a German edition for the German armed forces and the Wehrmacht. Cahun and Moore got copies so they could gauge how much the soldiers actually knew about the war. The news was both skewed and many weeks behind actual events. This made it possible for Cahun and Moore to create news sheets that predicted events and appeared to the soldiers to be prophetic. Their tracts were signed, "The Soldier Without a Name." The idea was to make it appear as if the information was coming from within the German ranks. At the bottom of each sheet, "Please circulate," was written in hopes that more than one soldier would read it. And that's the end of my reading.
So they were living in Jersey as Lucy and Suzanne, and they were
Yes.
middle-aged. And I love this because nobody would have suspected that these two women were circulating this resistance, little propaganda, little packages, hoping that some of the Nazis soldiers would have more humanity, and that it would appeal to these people who had the abilities to critically think and think otherwise. So I love the fact that nobody had originally suspected them, and they were doing this work, this important work, without suspect at first, but
yeah,
that they were eventually arrested for that. Yes,
that's right. So they did this. They actually, after they began the propaganda work, their house was requisitioned by the Nazis, and there were Nazi officer and some soldiers who were actually living in their house. They were allowed to keep a couple of private rooms, and they secretly did these propaganda tracts and objects and things while they had Nazis living in their house, which is even more surprising.
And they were almost caught a few times before that.
That's correct. Yeah. And then eventually they were caught. They had been, one of the activities they did was to buy big cartons of cigarettes and open them and put little messages in the cigarettes. And then they would distribute these cartons. And of course, the soldiers, finding a full packet of cigarettes was a great thing. So they would pick it up and they would find notes inside their cigarette packets. And they also did some work that is more connected to their earlier Surrealist work and the work of the 1920s, which we could talk about. I thought maybe I would just show a couple of images. There's almost none of this work still extant because the Nazis destroyed most of it. But I thought I would just show a couple images for context.
Yes, unfortunately, most of their work was destroyed by the Nazis. And these small remnants that are still available are little treasures.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So I'm now, can you see? Yes. Okay. So these are just some images of the occupation, the evacuation, and then some images of the Nazis on the Isle of Jersey. I wanted to just share also, this is an example of a sort of rough draft of one of the tracts that they made, where they took this very famous Heinrich Heine poem and they changed the words so that it was actually referring to Hitler causing all of his troops to drown rather than the Lorelei calling the sailors to their death. So this would have been a poem that, all of the German foot soldiers would have been very, very familiar with. And then another example, one of the things that they did was their house, this is actually, can you see my arrow? Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So this wall actually runs from their garden into the graveyard of this church, St. Prelad's Church. And part of the cemetery was meant for German soldiers who died on the island. I'm not exactly sure how they died. But in any case, one of the activities that they did, and I think this was before before and after the soldiers were billeted, not while they were there, but they made wooden sort of grave markers and they splashed them with paint, black paint and also red paint to signify blood. And then they wrote in Gothic letters on the for you, the war has ended. So basically it's, making the soldiers think about the only way this war is going to end for you is for you to die. And just hoping that this would spur people to question what was going on in the war, the evils of the war.
And then later the two of them were actually buried there in that cemetery, or
yes.
on the outskirts of the outskirts of that cemetery, they were buried together, and their gravesite is still there in the Jersey.
Yes, and when Claude Cahun died, she actually had a Jewish star put on her gravestone, even though the church was, not a Jew. It was obviously not a synagogue, so it wasn't a Jewish cemetery. But she had her father. Here, let me unshare for a bit. I'll just go back to give a little bit of her background now from when she was younger. She was born in Nantes, France, in 1894, and her father was the publisher of a major Republican newspaper. So that was a very left-wing newspaper, and he was Jewish, and her mother was Catholic. So they were a secular family, but her father was very proud of his Jewish heritage and passed that pride on to his daughter. And she suffered quite a bit as a child because of being Jewish. And
also her mother was mentally ill.
Yes, and her mother was mentally ill. Yes. Yeah. I thought I might just read a little description by Cahun of this sort of what it felt like when she was a child. This is in a memoir that she wrote post-war. She says, an Aryan mother, obese, struck by mental illness, institutionalized, a Jewish father at the time of the Dreyfus affair, an idealist education, even the thought of normal relationships and activities frightening my family. In order to protect me from a world that seemed a priori hostile and from a heredity judged to be a priori fatal, my father could offer me nothing better on my 7th birthday than this. I am very sorry for having brought you into this world. So sad.
It's for a parent to say that to their child, it's just absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah. And then
very much affected her as a child.
Yeah, and her mother, she describes her mother as naming her my little pig and pushing back the end of her nose. She says it saddened me to admit, or it saddened her to admit that despite everything, I did not have a Greek nose. So she's referring here to sort of the French ideal of the Greek nose and the fact that her features were very recognizably Jewish to people and to her mother's dismay. Her mother wound up being institutionalized. She was very, very mentally ill. And then when she was in her very early, well, when she was around 10 or 11, Dreyfus was, what's the word I'm looking for? He was acquitted or
scapegoated. I think he was.
No, when she was 10 or 11, he was actually released from jail. His conviction for spying, which had been confabulated, was overturned, and he was released. And there were protests in front of the newspaper, her father's newspaper, because it was pro-Dreyfusard and had been campaigning on his behalf for a long time. And then she started being bullied at school to the point where on one occasion she was tied to a tree and stoned. And her father pulled her out of her French school and sent her to England for a year to a boarding school just to get her away from this situation. And when she came back, she met this other girl. So Cahun's given name was Lucy Schwob, and she met this woman, Suzanne Malherbe, or this girl, Suzanne Malherbe, and they fell in love. She described it as being like a lightning strike, and they were together for the rest of their lives. And interestingly, Cahun's mother, when Cahun's mother died and Suzanne's father died, because the families were family friends, the remaining two parents married. And so now Cahun and Moore were stepsisters, which gave them cover, which was sometimes necessary at this moment in time, to be together, to live together, to be affectionate with one another in public, because they were sisters. And that's actually what the people on the Isle of Jersey called them. They referred to them as the sisters. So then they moved to Paris.
That's right. And under the guise of being sisters, they lived together and were openly affectionate, just like you said, and were able to live this queer life that was, of course, repressed in her childhood. Though she was influenced by her uncle, who was a queer poet, And
Yeah.
and that informed a lot of her early work as well, and that included a lot of the symbolism and the surrealism that she includes, that both of them include in their work.
Yes. So I wanted to just show a few images. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to make it so that I'm not sharing it properly. Hang on a second. I'm gonna get this right.
So they made some work in Paris in the early 20s.
Okay, there we go. Right. So these are probably, this one right here is probably one of the most famous images of Claude Cahun. From a very young age, she and Moore were, and they were very aware of the fact that they did not fulfill traditional norms of gender, of femininity. And this is a picture that Moore took of Claude Cahun, and the volume here is a magazine called Image de la Femme. And you can see that this image of Cahun is not obviously feminine. And then if this is the title page of that, which shows you sort of the feminine ideals at the time. So Cahun and Moore were together. They were casting around for ways of understanding their identity. And Cahun in particular became very interested in her uncle, Marcel Schwob, who was a symbolist poet who was gay, and also in Oscar Wilde and Daniel Douglas. And in fact, when Cahun was quite young, she published a number of symbolist-inspired essays, and one of them, in the end of the essay, she actually refers to Douglas's idea of the love that dare not speak its name as a kind of guiding principle for her. So she was really explicitly saying, I am homosexual, like Douglas. The two of them made this book together, Views and Visions, and the illustrations are by Moore and the text is by Cahun, and the texts are very symbolist inspired, sort of comparing the France of the 20s with an imagined, beautiful, happy France in her imagination.
The idealistic France, of course. And
Yeah.
they spoke
So,
about homoerotic aspects of classical culture as well.
right, right. So, and then this is their Paris apartment. And then also very well-known images by Cahun and Moore are these. They were called self-portraits initially. Some museums still require that, but a couple of scholars, including me, have sort of reconceptualized this and thought about the fact that it would have been really impossible to make these portraits by yourself. There are only one or two where there's any evidence of Cahun using a sort of remote cable to click the picture. And she created a book, Aveu en Avenue, in which she really thematizes the idea of collaboration as a creative practice and a practice of living with the lover. And so now most places have shifted to just call these portraits and have given them both attribution for the portrait. So here are some of the...
Many of them were photographed by Moore. So
right.
they worked together a lot in the sense that they were each other's photographers, or you know, at different points or for different images.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to just to give you a taste of some of the imagery. It's very complex. I've written a whole book about it. um, and
This one's my favorite. I love this piece.
That one is your favorite? Yeah.
One of my favorites. Yes,
yeah. So it's very complex. It's sort of the text is also a collage of images of, different kinds of texts. The text does not really explain the images. It sort of accompanies and enlightens us a bit about the images, but and almost all of, or many of the images in these photo montages are portraits of Claude Cahun at various stages of life. So you can see, for example, here's one of those single images that I showed, and then you can see that this is being used repeatedly in.
And we're not sure with this image if she is naked from the waist up, right? Because we think that this is a picture of her chest, but then there is in another photograph, it is a top with painted nipples and text. So we were trying to figure out if that is actually her undressed or if
Yeah.
it's the same kind of costume, because that costume was called the comic bodybuilder. That's the character that she's in up on the top left corner there.
Yeah. So and this is one of my favorite photographs. It's so she's really mixing gender cues. So on one hand, she's the bodybuilder with, the shorts and the bare chest. And on the other hand, the hearts on her face and the dark lips and the hearts on her legs and the little lips on her chest give us the sense of, being feminine. So she's really like playing around with the signifiers of gender. And then she does these series of other photographs where things become even more hard to discern. And so in this one, it looks like she's wearing the same outfit as there, but maybe she's actually bare chested, and the contrast is so high, we can't really tell.
But this is a play with costumes and masks and and a refusal to adhere to the conventions of femininity and
right.
to experiment with new identities and costume. So I really like this kind of phase in her life in the work.
Yeah. So after they made these photographs and they worked together on these photo montages, and I wanted to just one of the many reasons why Dina was chosen to be my interlocutor today is because her work has a lot of affinities with Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore's deconstruction of gender roles and questioning of norms of gender and sexuality. So Dina, do you want to say a little something about this project here?
When I first started, when I was asked to do this talk, I thought, why are they asking me? You know, I'm not a queer artist, really. And as I read the book and got to know more about these two women, and I feel like, and my intern said, you might not be queer, but you make queer art, which I thought that was very interesting. But early on in my career, I lived with a gay man who felt that he couldn't really be himself in society. And together, him and I created works where he morphed into these characters and also played with gender. And this is the work with David. We also experimented with masks and personalities and experimentation with costume and location. So I really felt that I knew like what it was like to feel kind of not to feel 100% accepted by society, also because I'm an immigrant child. So I came at an early age to Canada, and I had to fit in and learn new cultures and new norms. And so I feel like I kind of understand these people. And also living with the paradoxes that they were able to be a little kind of naughty, and nobody thought, anything of it when they were a little older in Jersey and working on their resistance. I love that nobody even thought, of them to do this. So I feel that there definitely is an affinity, and definitely there are parallels with my work. And I actually was able to see that the piece of Claude in the Mirror. I was able to see it live at the Biennale, which was really, really exciting. So yes, so thank you for seeing the parallels in my work. And of course, I talk about social matters, and my work is critical and requires dialogue. So thank you.
And I mean, I think especially this notion, one of the things that Cahun explores in the writings, and Cahun and Moore explore in the photo montages of Aveux en Avenue, is the way that little girls are socialized into being women through play and through fairy tales. And so here, this is an image of Cahun as a young child during the carnival. Then there are various signifiers of, the dolls. This is actually Cahun playing a kind of doll-like character in avant-garde theater. The character is called Elle. And then we've got paper dolls down here. There's some references to Jules Verne stories, and right in this little area, you can see there's a nursing baby. So that's a reference to the expectations of motherhood. And
I see there was no Barbie back then. It was only baby dolls.
Right, right. And so although now that the Barbie movie has come out, Barbie is suddenly like a feminist icon. When I was growing up, my mom wouldn't even let me play with Barbie because, Barbie was
they shifted the story in the movie, that's for
sure.
So I mean, I never saw Barbie as the victim at all. I saw Ken as the one that was living in her shadow, and while she got to do everything, and then he doesn't become his authentic self until one day he decides to. And then she of course she can't believe that this is happening. She ends up having a breakdown. So he finds his authentic self while she has a meltdown. So and eventually loses her head. That's the last frame of it's a sequential series. So another thing I really was amazed to discover was her writings, the heroines essays, which of course parallels with my work, and I'd like to hear more about that. Yes, those are two of my works from the Fallen Princesses series. But Claude, of course, had written these essays, which included some fairy tale characters.
Right. So this series was written before she did the photographs that we're familiar with, the single photographs. And basically, she took characters from fairy tales, from the Old Testament, from the New Testament, and rewrote their stories so that they were modern, at that time, modern 1920s women expressing their own desires. So, for example, Eve sits in the Garden of Eden waiting for Adam to come home from work. And she's reading advertisements for pep tabs, which are pills that will make him more virile. So that's just an example, and each one has its its own story. And so that sort of turning around of the fairy tale, it's a little different than what we see in your, for example, she does also have a Cinderella fairy tale, where Cinderella is, rather than being, upset about having to clean out the fireplace and all of that, she's actually a bit of a masochist and sort of likes being bullied by her sisters. And then it goes on to her being a dominatrix of the prince, using her shoes, so it's all very tongue in cheek.
Cinderella, not Snow White. That would be Cinderella.
Cinderella, yeah, right. Isn't this Cinderella?
Yeah, that's Cinderella. But
yeah.
both of us also speak about this notion of happiness due to the love of a male hero, and that's what women have been spoon-fed throughout history, is this notion that you can achieve this happiness, if you meet your prince. And
right.
I think these traditional female roles are emblematic of women in the West, and she too rebelled against that notion.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The
mythologies of traditional female roles, basically. So we have that kind of rebellion against that concept in common.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this, a lot of, as you can see, like in these photo montages and images, she's juxtaposing many different images of herself, sort of questioning the notion of a fixed identity, questioning the notion of traditional gender, referring to surrealist tropes, such as dream and castration. And here, this is another famous photo montage. You can see you've got this little writing around here says, behind this mask, another mask, I'll never finish wearing all these faces, or something to that effect. And these are all images of Cahun. Some of them have been sort of played with, but they are, on the one hand, they're like a head on there are a number of heads on necks, on a neck. On the other hand, this is a very phallic image that rises up from this neck here. And it's sort of a usurpation of the traditional notions of sexuality. And then up here, you've got La Sainte Famille and the sort of nuclear family all dragged along and attached together. So there's a big contrast between those two. There's a lot more going on in there, and it's very hard to say exactly what she wants us to understand by that, but each of us will bring our own backgrounds to it, and it will be multivalent, and that is what she hoped for in the resistance work, that rather than her saying to people, you must revolt, she wanted to inspire the soldiers to revolt.
And thank goodness that this was published. We talked about that yesterday, because her work was destroyed by the Germans, and there's just some remnants of her work left behind, and mainly the things that she was able to publish in the early 20s, because when she came to Paris, she wrote for quite a few publications, and they were assigned different jobs and journals, and this work was published. So things like this little book is a remnant of them, and thank goodness that they were able to be published.
Right. So and a lot of the negatives still exist. So a lot of, if you see the work, there's some, prints, vintage prints, but a lot of the work that you'll see in museums is actually a modern print from a negative, an original negative. And luckily, we also have the negatives that were used of the photo montages of the photo, which were produced as photolithographs. So that's why we have all the images, that and the whatever copies of the books are still out there. I thought maybe I would, it looks like we're getting to sort of the end of getting close to the question time. Kat, do I have time to read just a little bit more? I wanted to read a section that gives us a real sense of Cahun's motivating principles.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So this is at the end of the book. So she says, and this is in a sort of memoir that she wrote after the war. In order to tell the history of civilization, isn't it sufficient to show that the freedom to choose the good, to create it in oneself, for oneself, around oneself? Let me stop the share. Around oneself is constantly reduced to nothing for the greatest number of people? By the oppression of one class by another, by the blows received in the fight against oppression, by the conflicts between the oppressors, and at the same time, by all the natural accidents to which we are all exposed along the way towards the lethal accident that destroys us. It is most important that we be aware that we have limits and that we understand the fragility of our liberty, of our integrity. What are we to do about this? I seek, above all, to give awareness to those who don't have it. I affirm that the right to resist and help others resist natural and social evils is the primary human right. Today, even in the most human, peaceful, successful democracies, we are still more or less dispossessed of these liberties, of these rights. I reclaim them. I affirm that to the degree to which each of us is free to live according to our own conscience, each of us is responsible for our own actions, responsible to ourselves and everyone else. I affirm that the point is not to deprive people of liberties, but to give them responsibilities, as befits their conscience and their strength, to give them the means of cultivating the clearest awareness and the means of developing their strengths. Steer the biological and psychological sciences in this direction. Steer the next stage of socialist democracy in this direction. And soon the means offered from the outside will be available to everyone. But don't forget, these means cannot be imposed on anyone. Human beings can be destroyed from the outside. They can only be built up from the inside by themselves through the exercise of their own freedoms.
Well said.
So I think we've come to the moment when we can entertain some questions.
Kat, do you want to help us facilitate this?
Yes, I was going to say, if anyone has questions, you can write them in the chat, and I can read them out. I think also Jennifer can see them, so you could also read them and address them. So yeah, people can go ahead and start writing their questions.
Okay, so I see so a request for more information about the wartime experiences. Yes, there's a lot to be said about that. Especially the last chapter of my book is all about their wartime experiences and what happened when they were arrested and tried, and how they were ultimately released, because the island was liberated just before they were some of the last prisoners.
They were sentenced to death, actually.
That's correct.
And they were released just before. They actually also took these pills um, uh, to commit suicide when they were arrested, but the pills weren't strong enough. So she ends up waking up in a jail after,
Right.
she thought that she put her life to rest, but
Yeah.
then they spent this time in jail, and eventually they were able to be cellmates
That's
because
right. Yeah.
on the adoration of their guards and the people taking care of them at the jail.
Yeah, it's a it's a very complex series of events, very dramatic series of events, including the suicide attempts. They had a suicide pact. If they were arrested, they were going to commit suicide, but the initial attempts failed. And then when Moore woke up in prison, she thought that Cahun had died, so she tried to kill herself again, but also that failed. Luckily they weren't successful. But yes, it's a very interesting series of events. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is that although the Germans finally figured out that it was Cahun and Moore who had been doing all this propaganda, not a big group of German soldiers. They still kind of couldn't believe it at the end, and they had a little sort of trial of Cahun and Moore, where they were accused of using spiritual arms rather than firearms. And the spiritual arms were said to be more dangerous because you could, if somebody was using firearms, you could tell exactly what damage they had done. But if somebody was using spiritual arms in the way that they were, there was no way of knowing how many soldiers they had influenced. But they also talk about the fact that the Germans, even during the trial, when they had laid out all of the propaganda that they had collected, and Cahun actually describes it as kind of like an artistic retrospective that's that's laid out in front of them. And they didn't, they said, yes, we did this. And the soldiers still just, the people who were trying them still just couldn't really believe it. And so Cahun describes it as they condemned us without believing in our existence. And they tried to get them to, the Germans tried to get them to sort of recant, and they refused. And so then they condemned them to death. Yeah. And they were, I think that they really, really did not want to kill these two older women, and they had people on the island, the governor of the island campaigning and saying, you cannot do this. Like, this is going to look really bad if you do this. I mean,
although I was really disheartened to find out that the people of Jersey kind of collaborated with the Nazis and didn't really take any resistance on. So the society around them, were collaborating with these people, and I can only imagine what the atmosphere was in Jersey. But thank goodness that they were released just before they were sentenced to death. However, Moore lived 20 years, I believe, past Claude Cahun.
right.
And she died because of illness and disease that was a result of being imprisoned.
Yeah. So another question is, how did they get caught? And the way they got caught was that the the um, the tobacconist, um, whom they bought, cartons and cartons of cigarettes so that they could stick messages in the cigarettes and leave them for the soldiers. And the tobacconist was like, there's no way these two women can smoke that much. And so began to suspect that there was something else going on and perhaps knew about the messages in the cartons of cigarettes. It's not really super clear, but um, we believe that it was the tobacconist who reported them, and then they were uh,
Arrested.
arrested. Yes. Are there other questions? Let's see.
One just came in.
Oh, yes. Did they, were they interested in or collected Indigenous African non-Western ceremonial objects and art? Not to my knowledge. Yeah, so Cahun was obviously influenced by Dada and Surrealism. She read the journals, she had subscriptions, they had subscriptions to the journals. And you probably remember there's a photo montage with like x-rays and birds' beaks and scissors that looks pretty scary. There are a lot of dreams, dream
Ritual,
sequences in the
based.
writings. So they were interested in the surrealists, and then in the 30s, in 1930, when the book came out, became friends with Andre Breton, and they also had some very close. Cahun was very close friends with some of the surrealist writers like René Crevel. But I don't. She had some. They had some strange things in their apartment, but I don't think that they collected, African masks and that kind of thing. Although they were certainly aware of the surrealist interest in them. Did the Germans know Cahun was Jewish? I don't believe so. I mean, she would have, no, they did not. And they also didn't know that Moore.
But she certainly
Yeah,
looked Jewish. She wore it on her face. It was
yes,
not
this is true, but
easily.
yeah, but she would have been, deported to Germany if they knew she was Jewish. Um, they also didn't know that Moore was fluent in German. So that was one of the things that allowed them, that anybody who was fluent in German or was Jewish was supposed to self-report, and they did not do that.
One thing I think that we kind of left out and is very important is how they took on these names, how they took on these identities, and when that happened, when this shift in pseudonyms occurred.
Yeah, they were quite young. Claude Cahun, there were various pseudonyms that she experimented with. Claude Courly was one of them, and that's referring to a bird with a beak that's very kind of rounded. And then also Daniel Douglas, which was a reference to the queer poet. And then finally Claude Cahun, and Cahun was on her paternal grandmother's side, the name of a very well-known Orientalist scholar, Léon Cahun, and also her grandmother's last name. So let's see. Last question, were they in contact with other resistance in France or Europe? No, I don't believe so. Aside from just listening to the radio, to the BBC radio. That was pretty much it.
And they got arrested for that, actually, for having a radio, because it was illegal to have one on the Isle of Jersey, and
correct.
they had kept theirs for a long time. So that was part of the reason that they were arrested, was because they had this radio.
Yeah, they hid a whole bunch of stuff, and all of it was found and taken from their house. And so it looks like we are at the end of our time. And I think that Kat has some things to say to us.
Yeah. Yes, I just have a few closing words. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. And I also wanted to thank both you, Jennifer, and Dina for this insightful discussion. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else here did as well. And for everyone here at the event, we'll be sending out a post-event survey that only takes a few minutes to complete, so we can constantly improve our events. And we'll also be including links to Jennifer's book as well as to Dina's artwork. So look out for that. It'll be coming to you soon. So thank you again for today, and have a great rest of your day.
And thank you so much for inviting us. This has been really fun, and I'm always glad to spread the word.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye.